Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We are the Owatonna School Board. This is Monday. It's the 18th of March, 5:30. I'm going to call this meeting to order, and let's start, if we would, with the pledge.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Eric, if you would, the attendance for tonight.
Yes, Chase, we knew was going to be absent. Deborah and Aaron have not made it yet.
Okay.
Not sure on them.
Let's hope that we see them. As it relates to the approval of the agenda, there is one item I would ask all of you on item 10 that requires board action. Would you please add item E in there, and we'll call that Achievement and Integration Grant.
You have an E, but you
Right, we'll make E will become Achievement and Integration Grant, and F will be Gifts to the District. So there's an item that came up, needs our attention, timeliness, so we will take care of that now. And so with that change, I'll make a motion that we approve the agenda then as presented.
Second?
A motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor with an aye? Aye. Any opposed? That motion carries. Item 4 is Mission Moment. I'm going to turn things over to Mr. Elstad.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Tonight, I'd like to lift up two individuals separately tonight for different reasons. The first individual I'd like to have come up to the table, please, would be Sean Hughes. Sean is an unsung hero for our school district. He is our facility use specialist and middle school activities coordinator. With the opening of the new high school last fall, Sean's role has expanded as the beautiful new facilities certainly attract additional events and other uses. We appreciate Sean's expertise in handling multiple requests and finding the best balance of use of all of our buildings for the students, staff, and community. Sean also does an amazing job of handling all the responsibilities for coordinating middle school activities, including hiring coaches and officials, along with the scheduling to ensure our students have great experiences. You don't see Sean much because he's a busy man, but he is certainly someone who has big impact on our district to make sure that our facilities are scheduled the right way, and I so appreciate the work that you do for our district, Sean, and our community. Thank you. Any questions or comments from the board?
I appreciate that your brain works at that level of detail, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah. Thank you, Sean.
Appreciate it.
The next individual that I'd like to lift up probably needs no introduction, but I'd like to ask Jeff Williams to come up to the table, please. I am proud tonight to honor our Owatonna High School head football coach, Jeff Williams, who was recently voted into the Minnesota Football Coaches Association Hall of Fame. The banquet will be held in April. By racking up 207 victories on the field, Coach Williams leads the Big 9 Conference and Big Southeast District with the most wins in history for a coach. Coach Williams' influence goes far beyond the field as he instills work ethic, character, and integrity in his players. And most of all, I believe he's one of our finest teachers in the state. Jeff Williams, congratulations on being inducted to the Hall of Fame, but also for your service to our community. Thank you. Questions by the board?
How many kids, specific to football, in the high school team have you touched in your career so far?
I don't know how many I've touched.
Okay. With your influence and positivity and work ethic.
Scratch that. Scratch that.
Let me rephrase that, Judge. Your Honor, let me rephrase.
It's been a lot. It's working with Sean with the middle school kids. We have our fingers in that program very strongly. We work very hard with Drake and Eric at Park and Rec, Tim before that, running camps, helping them out with their program, and then the kids in our program at the high school level as well. It's an awful lot, and it's been person mistakes and sometimes old person mistakes. I've gotten to work with a great bunch of coaches, not only in football, but throughout our district. Great teachers that I've gotten to work with. And then obviously the kids, that's what makes it all worthwhile. And I always try to close out every banquet by thanking the parents for being such great parents because they make our job so much easier. Owatonna is a unique place with great families who raise great kids who make our job easier. And then, of course, Nancy, who raised our two boys while I was out working with other kids, couldn't have done that without her as well. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to come tonight.
And one of the rarities I've been able to not only coach with Jeff. I came here as a young coach, and he took me into the program. He probably never thought I'd be the superintendent of schools at some point in my career, but then also to coach two of my two boys. What a great experience, and they became better people as a result of you.
You have something?
I've always been amazed how well you've been able to articulate the knowledge of each of your players, especially during the football banquets. And I applaud that because it's hard enough to remember a classroom of students' names and what they've been and done versus all the football players you've had associated with also. Thank you for all your dedication for that.
I appreciate that, Eric, and when kids work as hard as they do to be excellent at something, we have to get to know them, we have to treat them as individuals, and that's something we take a lot of pride in our program. Thank you.
I would just make one additional comment. I know we're here to talk about football, but I just want to say, Mr. Williams was one of the best teachers my children experienced. Their science education was really quite inspiring, and one of them has taken off and is running with that one, so thank you for that.
It's the most important part of my day and the most important kids that I see, so I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Anything else?
That's it. Thank you, Mr. Williams.
Item 5 tonight is public forum. I'm going to check with Sarah one more time. Any cards for public forum? All right. We will move on. Item 6 tonight would be reports. I'll kick it back to Mr. Elstad for some introductions at this area.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Tonight, Lori Voles, our Director of Finance and Operations, will be presenting to you a budget update or an amended budget for the 2023-2024 school year. So, Lori, if you want us to come up to the table, please. And Sarah Cramblin, I'm sorry, who is our controller. Just as they're walking up, our finance committee did go through this material last week and have taken a look at the amended budget, but tonight Lori and Sarah are here to share the entire amended budget with you. So thank you, Lori and Sarah.
All right, and so to start off, I want to...
May I ask, Lori, that when you're talking, you have to kind of pull that microphone a little bit closer to you?
Okay,
So-
can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
All right, perfect. Good evening. And I can tell you I'm very happy to bring this updated amended budget for the current fiscal year. When we started working on this months ago, my main strategy here is to bring an updated, very accurate budget. So this budget reflects actual employees hired, not open positions. It's March, and we have set our staffing for the year, and so we updated it, like I said, on actual employees in place. Updated it based on updated calculations from MDE as well as our updated enrollment projection to drive the updates on the Gen Ed aid estimates. And variety of other new legislation that came in place July 1, and so it reflects a little more fine-tuned updates financially on all those different components. And just to kick this off, I have good news to share with you today. And we'll get into the details, but in a nutshell, we have a good, positive result budget here, and it will bode well for us as I start working on the financial projection for next fiscal year, which I'll be doing this week. And just as a side note, and when I get that done, I'll bring that to the Finance Committee and then for further discussion with the board as we work through the planning for next fiscal year. So with that, we're going to just hit some of the highlights. We'll start with the revenues in the general fund. Just highlighting some changes there. We saw an increase in the Gen Ed aid because we are funded in that category based on the number of students that we serve. And so we did see an increase in our estimate for Gen Ed aid of almost $400,000. We also had an adjustment kind of in the other direction, basically, for special ed aid came in lower than MDE had initially projected. And as a side note, special ed aid for this year is based on actual expenses in special ed in the prior year. And so MDE just had a higher estimate in place for our expenses than what we actually had, because last year we utilized a variety of funding streams, including some ESSER grants. So anyway, we still had very good news on the special ed aid, which I will get to in a different slide here, but it was one of the variables that we adjusted. Another piece of good news is actually in the area of interest earnings. Ended up being much improved compared to our initial estimate, which is about a $300,000 increase. Interest earnings, as you may be aware, rates have certainly been improved recently compared to prior years, and we are seeing the benefits of that. Another piece I would just want to point out that you can kind of pops out here on the listing is unemployment aid. We had estimated expenses to be much higher than they actually came for that hourly unemployment. That was a big talk on public schools. Now what happened there overall is it's neutral to our bottom line, because even though revenue's down, our expenses were down, and it was almost a match expense to revenue. And so this is just adjusting the revenue to what we actually received. And on the expenditure side, you'll see that unemployment expense budget was reduced to an equal amount. That piece is a wash. Another piece that improved from the original budget was we were able to fine-tune our achievement integration budget for the current year, the 23-24, and we were able to increase the revenue budget on that accordingly. So overall, with all those moving parts, all those adjustments in the general fund, overall the net revenues were almost identical at an increase of about $15,000. Just some swings between variety of line items. Sarah, is there anything else we should point out there? All right, so that is the general fund and just overall major changes. Then to look at the revenues for some of our other funds and food service, our revenues are up. So there's a big reason here is due to the universal meals. We are having higher participation from the students. More students are eating the school meals, and therefore we're receiving more federal revenue and an increase in state revenue as well. And so the revenue side is up, and then of course when we get to the expense side, I'll just point out that of course our expenses went up because our food costs went up because we're serving more meals. So, but overall that's very good. This is what we want. We want student participation, and it helps students learn when they are well fed. Community Service Fund also had some nice adjustments there. ABE had an adjustment there, so on the federal resources, part of that was probably federal ABE as well as the state ABE, where we are the fiscal agent for the consortium. So it's basically a flow-through to the other districts for the most part.
If I can pause you for a moment, Lori, ABE is Adult Basic Education.
Sarah, what other pieces on community ed that I can point out?
All other sources is mainly interest.
Oh, they also had interest earnings improvement. Well, as a side note, so did food service, as each fund is benefiting from that increased interest earnings piece. And then moving on to the building construction fund, we had an increase of revenue there, primarily due to the fact that we had, again, higher interest earnings than what was budgeted. And some of those final numbers definitely, in play here. Building construction fund, that is the old bond, and that we have basically final interest on that too. And as a side note, that old bond has been fully expended now, so that will, after this fiscal year, we won't see that line item on the budget anymore. And debt service fund, in that category, we had an increase in interest revenue.
And delinquent tax revenue.
And delinquent tax revenue, yes. So for delinquent taxes, there's no way to estimate that up front until you realize them, until they actually come in is when you recognize that as revenue. So in the amended budget process, that is commonly an item that you'll see a budget come through on that and see it as a budget adjustment. My stance is we don't want to overestimate. We're trying to be accurate as possible. And so debt service fund did see an increase of revenue due to that. So that's all positive on the revenue side of things. Now to look at our expenditures. Again, we'll start with the general fund. And again, just to emphasize, we updated this based on actual hires. It also reflects the settlements that we had with each of our bargaining units and all employee groups. And it also reflects an adjustment for purchase services. We can get into a little more detail there, but one example of the purchase services, it has an increase of $1 million. There's many components there, but one factor is we had to contract some of our special ed personnel, and so that's a piece there that's coming through. We had some professional services that came into play there. And so one thing I want to just point out, too, kind of going back to salaries and benefits. So you see salaries went up $461,000. Again, we had some open, let's say there was a lot of paras that we had in the original budget we were never able to fill. So those positions were removed. We had some other positions that we had posted and we're not able to fill. It's a tight job market, so it's been a challenge for us. So this reflects our final actual plans that we put in place. And you'll see benefits actually went down by $781,000. So part of that is the fact that, again, we had some positions that were posted and we put in an estimate that they'd select family insurance. Well, when those positions weren't hired, of course, that's a savings there. And so that's really a big factor there is regarding that. And also in the employee benefits category was the final adjustment on the unemployment expense. So as you recall, our actual revenue went down, and of course now on the expense side, that went down by equal measure. So you have a combination of things going on in that benefits line. And then, so again, looking at purchase services, I mentioned we had to contract some special ed positions, some other categories in that mix.
We saw an increase in our utility bills, so we had to increase our budget for those items. We did see a savings in snow removal, so thank you, Winter. And we did do a little bit of consulting in our IT sector, and we saw an increase in our liability insurance. So all of those changes together create that $1 million increase in that expenditure budget.
Supplies, materials, of course, a variety of things. One thing I want to mention that, of course, this budget reflects final grants figures. And so, like, for example, our Title I and our ESSER grants, they're federal grants, and MDE went through, they changed their portal. The portal's now called MEGS. And so they, as they were a little bit, I'll just say slow, as you can imagine with a new portal, it takes a lot to set it up. And so actually, once we got final approval on those grants, which included materials and supplies and a lot of these federal grants, so now you'll see The expenditure budget tie into those line items showing up here on the expenditure side, which of course on the revenue side, we had a matching amount. For any federal money, it's a dollar for dollar match. And so, any other comments on that category, Sarah? All right. Operating capital, of course, we had a smaller adjustment there. We did have some adjustments in operating capital, which, well, actually in IT, I guess I should say, which was some professional services there that was very needed that we put in place. But an adjustment of $83,000 is just a variety of smaller items. I don't know if anything particular comes to mind there.
The VPK van.
Oh, yes, the VPK van. You may recall earlier in the year, like August, we purchased a van because Owatonna Bus Company could only provide so much service in order to meet the needs of our students so they could get to school, and we are required to provide transportation for voluntary pre-K. And so that is an expenditure we made and has been working very well. Maggie tells us is that we are fully utilizing that van, and so that is driving that line item as well. And then under other expenditures, we had a slight decrease there of $119,000. Do you remember that?
The chargeback from nutrition services.
Oh, yes, okay. So we have a new methodology for charging, like I'll say, lunchroom supervision and custodial servicing food service. And MDE has a model laid out where instead of charging pieces of those particular positions to Fund 2, we actually do is a different accounting calculation, which is an indirect chargeback. It's just account codes happen to be another expenditure category. In the end, it's the same impact for both the general fund and the food service fund. It's just a different approach, which MD wants us to utilize this updated method for recognizing those expenses and moving those pieces to Fund 2, food service fund. So you'll see overall in the general fund, it had an increase of expenditures of $869,000. You see that on the top and the far right. And then in kind of the middle section, that's that same data, just organized in a different fashion by program area. So you'll see that broken down there. And so a lot of what I spoke to is already illustrated there. But the fact that regular instruction, vocational, special ed, you see a variety of things in play there due to positions that were initially posted but we couldn't fill. We also had special ed overall had an increase. Part of that, as I mentioned before, we had to contract some of the services, which is much more expensive than hiring our own employee. And then operating expenses and maintenance, a big driver there, as was mentioned by Sarah, is that we had to increase our utility budget based on actual expenses and a variety of utilities. But we did see an offset a little bit on savings on snow removal. Any other particular categories to point out?
I would just point out that the regular instruction decrease is largely related to that unemployment savings that Lori mentioned. So that truly did have an increase, but it got overall offset by that $500,000 savings in our unemployment cost and reimbursement budget.
So again, that's neutral to the bottom line because our expenses for that hourly unemployment, we got nearly 100% revenue match on that, which was a big question mark as we started the summer. There was, and we had our original budget, there was a lot of estimation and talk around the state that the state didn't have enough funds to pay that and reimburse us, so we were relieved to see that they came in fantastic in that category. So those are highlights in the general fund. Again, even though, as I said, even though the revenues excuse me, the expenses show an increase, but we also had an increase in our revenues as well. And I'll get into more of the details of how the general fund shakes out in a minute. Going on to expenditures and food service fund. Again, you see salaries actually drop, and that's because the new methodology for the chargeback of that labor is now showing up under other expenditures through a chargeback. It's almost a very similar amount. And then you'll see supplies and materials that went up due to the higher food costs because we are serving more meals. And then under community service fund, we saw an increase of salaries there. What's a big piece that's driving that is the teacher settlement, for example, and employee benefits adjustment is that just from new hires?
Yep.
Yeah, so that's the fact that we'd budgeted, like, say, family insurance for new hires, and maybe they waived it or took single, that type of thing. The increase of purchase services is probably tied to the Adult Basic Ed program, where it's a flow through for us to the member districts for a lot of it. And so overall, community service fund had an increase of expenses of $194,000. Again, they had some more revenues on the revenue side to counterbalance. Then moving on to the new high school construction fund, we have an adjustment showing increase of expense there, and a lot of that is timing of the construction. And so I want to emphasize we are on track in a very, very good spot with the overall cost of construction and the whole budget plan, with not only obviously the high school construction, but also the partial demolition and remodel of the old high school building for the district office. That is right on track. And we've been updating and reviewing that budget forecast very regularly, and we are in a good spot with that. The building construction fund category, again, that's that old bond, which is now fully depleted and spent, as I mentioned earlier. And that just shows an adjustment to the final cost there. And then the debt service fund, no change on that. It was exactly correct to start with principal and interest payments, etc. So then moving on to the fund balance summary, which summarizes how this all flows together. Starting with the general fund on the far left, and I'm just kind of hitch the bottom line so you can see the good news. So I'm with my cursor here on the far left. The unassigned fund balance as a percent of expenditures is landing at 12.14%, which is very good news. It's very similar to what we found in last year's audit, so we're very stable in that percentage. So that's the real good news of tonight. We were able to hang on to that. And also, I want to point out too, as you may recall from the original budget, we have some one-time expenses in LTFM and operating capital to support the renovations at the old high school building for the district office renovation. And that was a planned thing as we were spending down. Our LTF fund balance was at a very high level. So we utilized those funds, as well as we had a very high fund balance in operating capital. So we utilized that as a one-time expenditure to support that one-time project. So when you look on the far left under general fund, revenues compared to expenditures, you see that net change of a negative 3.5. That is due to that project. So those expenses go away next year. So it's just a one-time expenditure. So that overall is good news. So just another way to look at it is we were spending down LTFM $3,450,000, and operating capital was in the realm of 700 and some thousand. So overall, if you were to set that aside of that spend down from the construction, the general fund was actually making a gain revenues more than expense when you take that piece aside, and that is why we were able to achieve our unassigned fund balance and keep it at the 12% level, with that piece, along with the fact that we did make some updates to some of our assigned fund balance categories, which I'll get to that in a minute as well. But overall, I just want to emphasize what good news this is. We are right on track, so you can feel really great about that. I want to also comment that I've been in school finance for 40 years. I can tell you this was the most complicated budget in my career that I've ever put together. You had unique things with, the ESSER funds we had to utilize them because deadlines are approaching. And to put a plan in place on how to utilize those involved planning for many people. Administrative team, principals, central office administrators, and et cetera. We also had new legislation that came in place July 1 that had a lot of restrictions, but new funding streams for some of it. Some came without funding streams. And so to put all those pieces together and fully utilize the funding sources that we had available, as well as, we'll also mention that we had an update from the legislature on how compensatory funding could be used. And so that was a very detailed planning process, and a lot of work went into place to utilize those funds as per the new guidelines. And so all good news in the general fund. I just want to say how pleased I am with how that's coming out. Food service fund, again, you'll see in a nutshell there, they have a very healthy fund balance percentage at 34%, total fund balance ending up at the 1.4 million, very healthy there, because they're seeing a level of growth there to some degree. Community service fund, even though they did have a net change of a negative 15,000 overall, they have a very, very healthy fund balance, and I'll get into the details in a minute as well. But that's good news there. The high school construction fund, again, we are getting to the end of our construction there, and so while we see a 6.6 million estimated fund balance, that fund balance will be utilized as we finish that construction and those costs, final costs being paid out after July 1, so that'll be right on track. Building construction fund, then after that, again, you'll see zeros. There'll be a zero fund balance at the end for audit there. We are done with that one, as I mentioned. And the debt service fund is reflected here at 24%. And I do want to mention that on the debt service fund, by statute, we are, the formula calculates, because we must have a fund balance there, because we need to have assurances in place that we'll meet our principal and interest payments in the case that we have delinquent taxes. And if people don't pay all the taxes on time, we have to have a fund balance in order to make sure that we have funding to pay that principal and interest payment in debt service. And then I'll move on to point out with the health insurance internal service fund, we are self-insured for our health insurance for our employees, and we are having a nice year. What I mean, like health claims are coming in at a good level and not higher than expected, and so we have very good news on our health insurance claims there. And dental, same thing. We have a good situation coming there. Basically right on track with both those categories. So one thing I do want to point out, just going back to the general fund, you'll see the asterisk on the bottom of that page where it says total general fund expenditures in the calculations regarding the unassigned fund balance as a percentage of expenditures. We excluded the one-time LTFM and operating expenditures that were used to complete that project, that spend down piece, because I didn't want that to skew what we needed our general fund balance to be. So due to that unique factor, we excluded that particular cost in the calculation. All right, so this is a new page we added to the budget, and I just want to point out that it's illustrating for you when we talk about and list on the previous page, committed fund balance, assigned fund balances, and restricted fund balances. This is giving you the details of what make up those numbers. So you may recall the district had previously, the board had approved setting aside funds for committed for career pathways. That's at $559,000. We did have an extra donation come in place that had that particular committed fund balance increase a little bit. And then we created a new assigned fund balance for graduate fellow to support that initiative for next year's budget. Assigned for technology, we previously had a dollar amount in there. Made a slight tweak to put, it had been at 600,000, I believe it's now at 500,000. Just adjusting that to, make the budget all come into play as we need for this year. Assigned for READ Act, you may recall that in the original budget, I had that at 500,000, and the reason we set these funds aside is that the legislature did not provide funding to pay for all the training for our staff, and so we were setting funds aside. And Julie has done a lot of analysis on what training will cost for our teachers, and so for next year, she'll be projecting that it'll be at $250,000. So I adjusted that number to reflect her new analysis there. And of course, that is an item that we're going to continue to look at as more clarifying pieces come through MDE regarding that. And then a new category assigned for school farm. You may recall in past years, it was we would do cash rent for this piece of farmland the district owns. And now we actually it's operating farmland, and we have contracted with a farmer for contracted labor. And so we have a profit above and beyond what normally we'd be receiving in cash rent. And so that extra earnings, I'll say, we're setting it aside for future growth of that program. And so that's why you now see that new idea there, or new item there. And then assigned for unemployment, since we did get funding for this year, it did come through. Of course, the question mark is going to be for next year. There are bills in the legislature that certainly may provide a funding stream for that hourly summer unemployment. And so at this point in time, we put it to zero, and we did that to also achieve that fund balance of the unassigned fund percentage, the 12%, that we wanted to strive to do that. And so that was one of the tweaks I needed to make to get that unassigned fund balance to be where we need it to be. And then moving down into restricted categories is kind of for your information what all these restricted categories. These restrictions are all set by the legislature in part of formula where the legislature and therefore MDE is requiring us to, we track revenue and expense by all these categories, and that reflects then reserve fund balance. One thing I want to point out, restricted for the ALC, the reason you see a high level of $890,000 is due to the ESSER funds primarily, because during the pandemic, the summer targeted services, as well as like credit recovery and school year targeted services, the expense side was all paid by ESSER grants, but we were still generating gen ed revenue from the student minutes served. And so the revenue would come into this fund balance, but the expenditures are paid by a federal grant. And so the ALC will be able to utilize these funds over a multi-year period. And so of course that'll be something we examine closely in the next years of how to effectively utilize that for programming in the ALC. And then restricted for basic skills, that is showing a lower fund balance of $70,000. This is an area where we had a large carryover fund balance, and I had 4 conversations with the MDE They want districts, we need to be spending those dollars, and so I worked closely with the principals in developing plans to not only use their current year entitlement, but to expand that carryover so that we are utilizing those funds, because we certainly don't want the legislature to cut back on that funding stream, because we do have a lot of needs. So we made great progress there. Operating capital, that's, as I mentioned, that was at a very high fund balance, was about at $1 million, and we have a one-time spend down for that construction and renovation at the high school. So now you see that fund balance estimate at $142,000. And then restricted for EL, we have a new updated formula in that category, so we'll have continued plans on how to utilize those funds, because we do have great needs in EL. And then down to restricted for long-term facility maintenance, you see that's a negative $542,000. Remember I mentioned we are spending down that fund balance to support the completion of the renovation at the old high school for the district office. But really what's driving that negative is the pool project. So the pool project is going to be starting in May and going through July. And if that pool project had been, usually projects like that you start in June and it goes to August. If it had been June through August, our fund balance would have been zero. So that negative is reflective of just the timing of that pool project. Overall, we have funding for everything. So at the end of next fiscal year, that fund balance on LTFM will show zero. We'll be back to normal there. And then restricted from medical assistance, that also we're spending down some of that fund balance as when we had new hires in special ed, whether there were some teaching positions or BIs, we put that to this category to utilize those funds. And that is the why. This is a side note. I just ran the calculation for special ed aid for next year as I look at the financial forecast, and due to increases in special ed and in the category of special ed charged to medical assistance, our special ed aid is going to be going up substantially next fiscal year as well as this year. And so I just want to point that out. And then in restricted for community ed, I'm just reviewing those fund balances there. Very healthy overall. Community ed and school readiness, very high fund balances. Adult basic ed is probably the one, given the volume in that program, is a much tighter fund balance. And so I know Deb will be working hard to align the program due to the teacher settlement pieces in that program. So those are what the restrictions are, and it kind of ties back to that previous summary page we reviewed moments ago. So we have this review of the special ed revenue. Historically, the district has reviewed this. And I do want to point out, as you may recall, it was a big topic of discussion for our original budget for the 23-24 years, that the state aid is going up so much in special ed in the category of cross-subsidy aid. This graph just reflects our challenges in the past. Expenditures is in that kind of brown bar, and then the revenues in the blue. And the state has been very behind in funding equitably, I'll say, special ed, and the general fund has had to pick up the difference. And we made great strides. The legislature made great strides the previous spring in addressing that. And so that cross-subsidy aid went from $414,000 of revenue up to $2.2 million. And so that is huge, and it's huge for stabilizing our finances, the fact that they improved the special ed aid formula in the category of that cross-subsidy aid. And as a side note, on their initial run, they thought it was going to be higher than 2.2. So this is the final run. Virtually it's very close to final because it's based on previous year expenses. The one caveat there is we do have to wait to year end to see what the final net tuition costs are in that category. So overall, super good news. And so I wanted to share that with you. And those are hitting the highlights. Anything else that we want to comment on? Otherwise, good news all around. A lot of nuances going on here with the budget. And, but an increase in the gen ed formula and the improvement in the special ed aid is a big reason why this budget works and comes out as favorably. Any questions?
Yeah. So if I leave here and somebody stops me, I want to make sure I'm clear in understanding this. On page 2, page 1, overall revenue, the change is that revenue increased $15,000, 14,808. Sound right?
Yes, overall revenue in the general fund.
And on page 3, the increase in expenditures was $869,000. Now, I adore your enthusiasm for how great things look. I just want to make sure I'm understanding. I mean, there's a lot of daylight between those two numbers.
Yeah. So the main caveat there, remember I talked about unemployment and how we removed the reserve for unemployment, the assigned funds. That helped fund the increase on the expense side.
Okay.
Does that make sense? We tapped into that set aside to make the bottom line come out.
Okay.
Does that make sense? In a nutshell, I mean, there's so many moving parts here, but a simple answer is that.
Okay. And then the last question I have for you would be, on this very last page, the special ed, or page 7, I should say. So between the cross-subsidy and the meaningful increase in federal aids and grants, that is what's helping to also close the gap.
Yes. So yes. So between updated figures on the special ed aid, that is huge, as well as fully utilizing other state aids, categorical aids, and the federal grants. Utilizing all of them, I mean, I can tell you, we didn't leave a stone unturned. I looked at every single possible funding source and how do we have existing eligible expenses that we could fund there, or looking at how to efficiently utilize those funds.
Thank you.
Lori, can you just clarify for me that, so the unassigned fund balance as a percentage of expenditures, so we're at 12.14%. Our goal is 8 to 10%. Is that unassigned fund balance essentially a cushion for us? Or can you just explain that a little bit more for me?
Yes, it is. It kind of gets to the question is what is the need of a fund balance, right? And how large does it need to be? So having a fund balance is crucial for so many things. It provides financial stability, and it shows is a data point of your financial stability and the health of the finances. And so as a minimum, the bare bones minimum that districts need for a fund balance is at least 1 month of operating expense. Think about it, we are a service entity. So the majority of our expenses are for people. And we have to be able to meet payroll. And just because you have a fund balance doesn't mean that's what you have in cash. So you need to have a fund balance at a reasonable level in order to have enough cash on hand. I'm going to tell you a story. When this was about 15 years ago, of course, the state of Minnesota has been in a very good financial position, but back then, the state was in a budget crisis. And in order to balance their budget, they metered what's called metering our state aid, which means instead of getting 90% of the aids that we're entitled to this year, they changed it that, districts, we're only going to pay you, it was something like 70% of the money that is due to you this year, and we're going to make you wait till next year to get the rest. So in the district I was at that time, we had a 16% fund balance at that time when the state budget crisis hit, and they had to meter our aid, which meant we were getting much less in aid installments every month. We had to borrow $6 million to pay payroll. So that kind of gives you an example of why you need a fund balance, is to make sure you can meet your cash flow obligations. So that's, in my opinion, probably the most important reason. And then another reason is in the case when you issue bonds, which the district issue a bond to build this gorgeous new high school. And this is exactly a piece they look very closely at to establish your bond rating. And if you have a good statistic on your fund balance, you will get a better bond rating, which means when you sell your bonds, you're going to get a better interest rate, which that means it's going to save for the taxpayer when the principal and interest payments flow through to the tax statement. And so all those pieces come together. Now, a lot of districts, they may have a fund balance policy of 16% or 14%. I would say a vast majority have, at bare bones, is 8%. I would say a lot of districts are in that area of 10% to 12% or higher. It all depends on kind of what's going on also in their district. And that being said, each year a district's fund balance policy should be reviewed based on what's going on at the state, what's going on locally, and also based on what are the upcoming financial challenges in the next couple years. Could come into play for a board to consider their fund balance level. So the fact that we're at 12% now, and let's say fund balance policy is 8 to 10, well, I'll be able to give you an update very, very soon on what next year is going to look like. And we'll need to have a discussion about the fund balance. Because as I do that forecast, let's say, even if your expenses are going up due to inflation, that calculation comes into play where, let's say you are breaking even, but your fund balance percentage may be going down. It's just how the numbers work. And so I'll be able to tell you soon how that projection, how next year's fund balance percentage may be shaking out.
If I can add one thing, Ms. Hedlund, 8 to 10%, as I've been told, is about 6 to 8 weeks of operation for the district, so about 2 months worth, and that's why it was set at that sort of 8% or a little better. As Lori indicated, as we look at future years, a healthy fund balance also helps us to identify a way to spend that down, so that we can look at our timely ask of our community for additional funds to make sure that we can be able to spend that over a period of time without you shouldn't have large fluctuations in your fund balance, unassigned fund balance. It should be very steady and then slowly dissipate as the cycle of your operating levy sort of comes to a close.
So, Lori, will you let us know if we need to change that recommendation from 8 to 10% to something else?
So as I had envisioned this, as I update the financial forecast and update the finance committee, in all that, as we are looking as I develop and bring that original budget as well to the board, that would be a piece that we would review. How is it going to fit as we develop the next year's budget?
Yeah, I think, Elizabeth, the only thing I would comment on is, I heard you use the word goal. I would say, you know, the 8 to 10, I don't know that it's a goal each and every year, because that would probably not be fiscally responsible. In other words, like comments Mr. Elsted made, you know, it's our goal and intent to keep it fairly flat and balanced over time so that we're not going back to taxpayers. And I think that's the one thing that I guess maybe hasn't been commented on that I'll just add here, is that given the careful use of ESSER funds and a number of other practices that our district has done, and I really, you know, look to our leadership and our financial team, you know, we've been able to stave off additional requests from the public for levies, right? And part of that is because we've been able to maintain a reasonable and yet, a reasonable fund balance. So I don't want you to think 8 is a goal. When we get to 8, then we got other issues for sure.
Anybody else? Further questions? Mr. Elstad, anything to add here?
No, I don't. Thank you.
Lori, Sarah, thank you very much. Okay, item 7 tonight would be general information. Do any of you have a question, any questions for Mr. Elstad with regard to the enrollment report? It was in your packet. No? Okay, we're going to move on. Item 8, discussion, no action required by the board. Elizabeth, do you mind if I start on your end? Board forum.
Sure, I don't have anything.
Okay.
Nothing tonight.
Yeah, we had
Right.
we gave our updates last week.
Yeah, same here. I think we have a policy committee later this week, so we'll have something to report, but nothing else.
Nothing for me.
Okay. Mr. Elstad, administrative report.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on a few things tonight and then make an introduction if I can at the end of my report. I wanted to let you know that we are working, Ms. Voles and I will be working on formulating a transportation safety committee. This will be a committee that's comprised of parents, some of our officials that work at the bus company, as we start to think about some new routes potentially that will be coming into play. We want to be able to identify where some of those natural barriers are for safety in our community. And we're just going to be putting a committee together of probably 10 to 12 individuals that are representative of our parents and admin and so on to help us with that so that we can make a good collaborative effort on what are some of those barriers. And that process will begin in late April or early May. I want to publicly thank our input and design team for their work on our attendance area. This is not a decision that we take lightly and went through many iterations and a lot of input to try to arrive at what we felt was the best possible solution that you're being presented with and that recommendation for approval this evening. As many of you have heard, a week from tomorrow night, Governor Walz will be delivering his State of the State address from Wenger Performing Arts Center at Owatonna High School. We're pleased to have Governor Walz here to present that. I believe it may be the 12th time that the governor's address has been delivered outside of the Capitol. And so we're pleased to have him here, and it's an honor to be asked by any of our governors to use our high school as that platform. April 8th at our next work session, I will have a guest with me. Timothy Masawe, who is a fellow Rotarian from Tanzania, will be with me, and he just wants to thank the board for the work that our fellow Rotarians in our community did, but also the donation of furniture that was able to arrive at 8 different schools in Tanzania, which is a great effort. And quick legislative update, they'll be taking some of their holiday breaks coming up here, but we did see a passage of a bill last week that was signed by Governor Walz, our school resource officer bill. We are very happy to see that there is more clarity for our school resource officers. As I've mentioned many times, we have an excellent relationship with the Owatonna Police Department. We have 2 great school resource officers that mean a lot more than just an officer in a building. They connect with our students, they build relationships, and that's the intention. There was a little bit of a hiccup with last year's bill, and they clarified some of that, and I think with my conversation with Chief Mundale, we feel much better about the way that this bill has been rewritten and some of the legislation was cleaned up and clarified. So we feel really good about that. The governor's supplemental budget will be delivered tomorrow, so we'll learn more about that. And last but certainly not least, I want to introduce that we have gone through a process and have hired 2 new building administrators to our district. And the first of which that I'd like to recognize that is here tonight is Mr. Justin Lang, and Justin will be serving as the new principal at Lincoln Elementary, and I'd like to have you join me in a round of applause for Mr. Lang. Certainly you'll get to hear from Mr. Lang next year, but he's excited, and it's always nice too to see some of our staff members that have been here while preparing themselves and coming through our system. So Mr. Lang, welcome to our administrative team. And then I'd also like to recognize Dr. Martina Wagner will be joining us as the principal at the Area Learning Center. I don't see Martina here tonight. I'm guessing she's probably serving at a current board meeting as she is the current superintendent for the Red Wing Public Schools, but she will be joining us as our ALC principal starting on, and both of those posts will start on July 1st. So I'm happy to have such high caliber candidates that are taking over leadership roles in our district. And I believe that concludes my administrative report this evening.
Any questions? Very good, thank you.
Thank you.
We will move on. Item 9 tonight would be the consent agenda. The quick reminder, we are approving the minutes from February 26, March 5, and March 11. This would include the personnel report. Happy to pull anything out if necessary.
No, I would just like to highlight, it made me smile, some of the names on the personnel report of the individuals that are coming back for a short term to help us cross the finish line.
Good.
So, it's awesome.
Would one of you be kind enough to introduce the motion?
I move that the board approve the consent agenda.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Eric, if you would, please.
Yep. Elizabeth?
Aye.
Tim?
Aye.
Jolene?
Aye.
Lori?
Aye.
Mark?
Aye.
And I myself is an aye. 6-0 pass.
Motion carries. Thank you very much. Item 10 tonight, a couple items that are taking up board action. First one, the 23-24 amended budget. We just heard about that. I think we had ample opportunity to ask questions. If one of you has that particular motion queued up, I'd sure appreciate it.
I move that the board approve the 2024-2025 amended budget as presented.
Second.
Is it 24-25 or is it 23-24?
Written incorrectly in the recommended
Ah,
motion.
thank you, Tim. Yes, I was reading off the page.
Sure.
I'll start that over. I move that the board approve the 2023-2024 amended budget.
We just don't want to get ahead of ourselves.
We do not. We do not. Thank you.
Second that one.
Okay, we've got a motion and a second. Any
thought.
further discussion on that? Hearing none. All in favor with an aye?
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion carries. Item B would be the resolution relating to the termination and non-renewal of the teaching contract of probationary teachers. All of that information is available to you. Do any of you have any questions for Mr. Elstad with regard to that?
I guess this is the first time that, just being new to the board, that I think I've seen this. So maybe just some clarity around, is this a letter that just goes out automatically, or is this something that's brought to the board for each individual, or I'm not sure how that works.
What you're being asked to consider approval of tonight is that all of these staff members have been communicated with by building leadership for a multitude of reasons that are included in the description this evening, including performance. We also at times have to curtail programs or financial limitations, but all of the individuals have been spoken to about the fact that they are being considered for non-renewal.
Okay. So this is just approving the standard letter that just goes out? Got it.
That's correct.
Okay.
It does happen every year. I don't,
Yeah, this is
I may not
Maybe
recall
it
last
didn't
year, but
happen
it
last
is.
year.
Oh, yeah, I don't recall. but-
commitment in the district to inform staff that we are non-renewing before we typically have the end of third quarter come up, which would allow them ample time to seek other employment.
Sure.
Yep.
Okay.
Any other questions? Tim, do you have it queued up?
I move that the board approve the resolution relating to the termination and non-renewal of the teaching contract of probationary teachers.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Eric, if you would, please.
Elizabeth?
Aye.
Tim?
Aye.
Jolene?
Aye.
Lori?
Aye.
Mark?
Aye.
And I myself is an aye. 6-0 pass.
Motion carries. Item C tonight would be attendance boundaries. Now, we had a special work session 2 weeks ago. We had an opportunity at our work session last week to discuss this as well. I see that Dr. Queener from Teamworks is here, would be able to answer any questions. Is there anything else, folks, that you have any questions on relative to the recommended boundary change? Jolene, do you have it?
Yep. I move that the board approve the attendance and area model version 2C-AB 2-1 as recommended by the design team to be implemented the 2024-2025 school year.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none. All in favor with an aye?
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion carries. Item D would be the 2025-2026 school calendar. This has to do with the READ Act and the changes that have been made to implement or make available training dates throughout the school year that would be an adjustment to the previously approved calendar. Any questions from anybody?
Add one thing, Mr. Chair. This calendar also, we do our best to try to push calendars out a couple years in advance for families. We do have a calendar committee that has also vetted this calendar as well. And so what you're looking at is not only, as you indicated, but also just in general, this will be the first time that the board will have been recommended approval for the 2025-2026 calendar.
Not a big deal, but I just didn't see a date on the homecoming.
Yeah, so that date typically is not communicated because the activities directors come together and they put together the schedules for a couple years at a time. So that is one that will probably hang out there probably until next spring before we know that homecoming date.
So, Mr. Elstead, I just have one question. I appreciate you calling out, it's a 25 calendar.
That's correct,
Yeah.
25-26.
Do we have READ Act training embedded within this calendar year as well as we do in the 24-25, or
So we don't
No.
have anything called out. We are doing, we are taking this Herculean task on next year to try to train the staff we need to,
Yeah.
recognizing fully that we will have some staff members that will, residual that will need to train the following
Sure.
year, but not at the scale that we have for next school year.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. It's not because of the READ Act. It was the next year out.
Well, there will be some carryover with 25-26,
Right, we
but
already
just not
did
at
the
the same
25.
level.
Right, that's.
That was last meeting. Yeah.
Yep.
Any other comments or discussion? Elizabeth, by chance, do you have this one queued up?
Sure. I move that the board approve the 2025-2026 school calendar as presented.
Second.
Have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor with an aye?
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion carries. Item E, we just added this tonight, and I'll ask Lori Vols to come back up if you would, please. This we're calling the Achievement and Integration Grant. This is a topic that came up and needs some quick response on the part of the board to meet a deadline.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, Superintendent, for your consideration would be approving next year's 24-25 Achievement and Integration Budget. How the process works is that we had an initial application that is a 3-year, and next year will be our 3rd year of that 3-year plan. And so the budget that's laid out is very similar structure because it has to align with how the application was written originally. And so MDE just had training sessions on it like 2 weeks ago. They had us submit the budget for their initial review, and they got back to us basically last Thursday, and the deadline to submit the budget was last Friday. And then they explained that actually the board approval comes next. It's kind of an interesting timeline. Seems a little backwards to me, but this is what we're following. And so basically the next step is to get board approval on this. They wanted the board approval and signatures thereof by April 1, and due to our calendar timing, this is where we're at with it. And basically is, again, continuing the methodology and the programming we had in place in the previous years, but it addresses things like Rising Scholars Program, also has success coaches, the REACH program, and there's also the Rising Scholars piece of the program, and then the oversight of administration that guide those planning processes. It's just in a nutshell. So it's very similar to in the past. I can say that we really reviewed everything very thoroughly to make sure we could maximize it. And as I mentioned, even on this year's budget, I mentioned how we improved that budget piece because we, through communications with the MDE, we could identify more thoroughly how to utilize it, and it's reflected in next year's budget plan. So we'll be maximizing the funds as appropriate. So the top page just shows our entitlement of, like, for example, the initial revenue for the achievement and integration is $542,000, and then the incentive piece, which is a separate subcategory, is $52,000. And so we are basically tapping into those funding streams in a very adequate fashion for next year.
Lori, can you just summarize maybe, we don't all have a copy of what you're looking at. Is the grant bigger than it was? Is it the same?
Is it the same as last year? What did you say?
Well, it's a 3-year
It's
allocation.
Yeah, so this
correct?
is our year 3. Next year will be year 3. So we'll be watching, when I watched the webinar, what they said is in the fall, there'll be some initial information, which Julie and I will be watching this and tracking that. If we qualify again, then we need to respond by a certain deadline to apply for the next 3-year segment. So is that
Yeah,
kind of
I
address it?
misunderstood. So we're just approving the third year of funding, in other words.
Right.
We're not looking
Of
at
the
the
existing
next.
plan.
Correct, thank you.
Right. Mhm.
I misunderstood.
Any other questions? Anything else we should know?
That's basically it in a nutshell.
Okay. With that, then I will make the motion that the board approve the Achievement and Integration Grant as presented at tonight's meeting.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor with an aye? Aye. Any opposed? That motion carries. Item F tonight would be gifts to the district. Mr. Elstad, anything of the gifts to the district that you wanted to call out?
Not necessarily, just I'm always grateful for the generosity of our community, be it when they're donating instruments or just providing a few dollars here and there to help with some of the expenses for our activity groups. So just always grateful to live in a community that continues to give.
Do you have it?
Yep.
Eric, if you would.
I move that the board approve the resolution for acceptance of gifts as presented.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Eric, if you would, please.
Elizabeth?
Aye.
Tim? Jolene? Lori?
Aye.
Mark?
Aye.
And I myself is an aye. 6-0 pass.
Motion carries. Item 11 tonight would be to adjourn. I'll make the motion that we adjourn this meeting.
Second.
Motion and a second. All in favor with an aye? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Thanks, folks. Good meeting.